A black janitor was mocked during a tech pitch, then unlocked the system nobody could fix. He stood quietly in the corner of the glass-walled conference room, hands resting on the mop handle, eyes lowered, as if he was part of the furniture. Unseen, unnoticed. The young tech CEO at the head of the table was mid-pitch, his words slick and rehearsed, backed by a flashy slideshow and a $10,000 wristwatch. The room was filled with investors in tailored suits, sipping bottled water flown in from somewhere expensive, nodding at buzzwords like blockchain resilience and disruptive AI. But no one noticed the janitor. Otis, a black man in his 50s, with work boots scuffed from years of walking halls no one remembered he cleaned. His uniform was faded, with a stitched name tag that simply read Otis. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak, just moved silently along the edge of the room, wiping fingerprints from glass doors that would never open for him. And then it happened. The projector froze. The screen blinked twice, then went dark. Laptops began locking out one by one. Someone tried to refresh the network and failed. A whisper from the assistant. "We just lost connection to the servers." A beat of silence. Then laughter. Polite, but tinged with panic. The young CEO cracked a joke. "Looks like someone forgot to pay the internet bill," and turned toward Otis with a smirk. "Hey man, you got any duct tape for the Wi-Fi?" The room erupted. They laughed at him, not with him. Otis just looked up for a second, nodded, and walked away without a word. But 24 hours later, when a full-blown cyber attack crippled the company's system, when engineers and consultants failed to crack the code holding their files hostage, it wasn't the CTO who saved them. It was the janitor, the man they mocked in passing, the man they never asked about, the man they never saw. Welcome to Cracks of Light, a place where we share true, quiet, powerful stories about the people the world tries to overlook. If this already feels like a story worth telling, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and help us keep shining light into the cracks the world forgets. Now come with me, back to before they knew his name. Back to the first time Otis walked into that building, holding not just a mop, but a lifetime of brilliance no one bothered to ask about. He wasn't always invisible. There was a time when people called him Sir, when his emails were answered, when rooms went quiet so he could speak. But that time was long gone. Now, Otis Monroe pushed his cart through marble-floored lobbies and past glass elevators without a single glance. He had become part of the architecture, like the fire extinguisher or the exit sign. Always there, rarely noticed. The day after the pitch, when the company's system began to unravel, Otis had already seen the signs. He'd noticed strange IP activity in the guest Wi-Fi logs while wiping down a desk the night before. He had flagged in his mind, out of habit, because once upon a time, spotting patterns had been his job. But these people didn't ask the janitor what he thought about cybersecurity. They barely said hello. Earlier that morning, before everything spiraled, Otis had entered through the back door, as usual, nodding at the guard who never remembered his name. He had just finished cleaning the third-floor restroom when he passed a meeting room where a group of engineers were joking about legacy code. One of them said, loud enough to carry, "Maybe we should bring in Otis. I bet he knows all about ancient systems." They all laughed. Otis didn't slow his pace. He'd heard worse. Rejection wasn't new. Years ago, after leaving the military, he applied to over 60 tech firms. Some turned him down with generic emails. Others didn't even respond. Eventually, he stopped trying. He needed money, and when the offer came to work as a janitor at Greydrop Technologies, he took it. Pride had already been chipped away by hospital bills, foreclosure papers, and funeral costs. What mattered now was stability. His daughter Simone was finishing high school, and he wanted to be there every day when she came home. He took the night shift to make sure of it. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in East Oakland, nothing fancy, but safe. Every evening before work, he'd pack his dinner, kiss Simone on the forehead, and whisper the same thing. Keep your head high. Life may push you down, but you get to decide how deep it sinks you. Otis believed in quiet dignity, in doing right even when no one's watching. That's why he still returned wallets he found in trash bins. That's why he once gave his coat to a stranger waiting at the bus stop during a storm. That's why, last year, when a junior developer dropped her phone in the lobby and kept walking, Otis chased her halfway to the parking lot just to return it. She never thanked him. That didn't matter. What mattered was doing what was right. But the world didn't always reward that. The world often looked away. That week, after the system crash, no one knew yet that a storm was coming. People moved on like everything was fine. The engineers joked, the CEO prepped for another pitch, and the interns gossiped in the break room. Otis continued his work, quietly noting the increasing number of locked files and delayed access logs on unattended terminals. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He wasn't sure anyone would listen. But someone had been listening. Or watching. A black SUV had parked outside the building every day that week, just far enough not to be noticed. A woman inside with sharp eyes and a federal badge sat still, scrolling through reports flagged from a Department of Defense database. One name had popped up, Otis Monroe, classified contributions to military encryption during his deployment. Unlisted citations from cybersecurity missions labeled high risk. A man whose name should have ended up at a university or a tech lab, but instead was listed as janitorial staff. She watched a video from 2 nights earlier, grainy surveillance footage of Otis unplugging a faulty router in the server room, adjusting its firewall manually, typing commands with precision. It wasn't part of his job, but he had done it. She leaned back in her seat and whispered, "How the hell did they miss this guy?" Meanwhile, inside the company, things got worse. Files began disappearing. Emails bounced. Payroll was frozen. By the end of that day, panic spread like wildfire. The IT lead locked himself in the server room, frantically typing code he barely understood. The CEO paced like a cornered animal, barking orders at everyone. Ava, the receptionist, caught Otis in the hallway and whispered, "Do you know what's going on?" He looked at her with a calm expression and said, "I know what's coming." She didn't understand, but she felt the weight in his voice. That evening, Otis walked home later than usual. The air was cold. His knees ached, but he didn't complain. He entered the apartment quietly. Simone was asleep on the couch. Textbooks sprawled around her like fallen leaves. He tucked a blanket over her shoulders, then sat at the kitchen table, opened his old laptop, and began writing code. Not for a job, not for a paycheck, just for clarity, just to stay ready. Because when you've lived through enough battles, you stop waiting for someone to call your name. You prepare like war is always near. Back at the office, no one suspected that the man who cleaned their messes was also the one silently building a script that could decode the attack, crippling their system. They didn't know that the janitor had once written a fail-safe encryption method still used by defense contractors. They didn't know because they never asked. And Otis never told. He believed that silence was not weakness. It was restraint. But sometimes restraint runs out. And just as the chaos reached its peak, just when it felt like the whole company might collapse, a name echoed in a hallway full of fear. "Where's Otis?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't panicked. It was spoken like someone had finally realized the man they ignored might be the only one who could save them. Otis heard it. He stood still for a moment, staring out the window into the night. Then he closed his laptop, picked up his keys, and walked back into the fire. The sky over Silicon Valley was gray that morning, thick with the kind of cloud cover that made the city feel smaller, heavier. Inside Graydrop Technologies, it was already chaos. Passwords were failing. Servers were inaccessible. Clients were calling, angry and confused. Every screen in the building now bore the same red message. Your data has been encrypted. Pay $2.5 million in crypto within 48 hours or lose everything. The CEO's face had lost its color. His hands trembled as he flipped through pages of emergency protocols that no one had ever practiced. Engineers were on calls with external security firms, but nothing worked. The system kept rejecting every attempt to override it. The CTO, a man who had once bragged about being unhackable, sat at his desk in silence, unable to explain how this happened. And then Otis walked in. No one had called him. He just knew. He entered the control room quietly, without a badge or access code. No one stopped him. He carried nothing but an old laptop tucked under his arm and a calmness that didn't belong in a room filled with panic. The CTO blinked, confused. The CEO raised an eyebrow and asked sharply, "Why are you in here?" Otis met his gaze and said, "Because you need help." And you're out of time. There was a pause. The kind of pause where pride wrestles with desperation. The CEO scoffed. You're the janitor. Otis didn't flinch. He placed his laptop on the table and began typing. In under 2 minutes, he isolated the ransomware's entry point. He traced it back to a developer's exposed API, one that had been left open during testing, but never properly secured. The room went silent. Every eye was now on Otis. The CTO leaned forward, watching in disbelief as the janitor, no, the man, wrote line after line of elegant code, bypassing locked pathways and isolating the malware. Otis's fingers moved with quiet precision, his breathing steady, his focus razor-sharp. In 20 minutes, he had built a counter script. In 30, he had reversed the encryption. By the end of the hour, the red screens vanished. Files returned. The system rebooted. Greydrop Technologies had been saved by the man they'd all ignored, and not one of them knew what to say. Ava was the first to speak. Her voice was soft but clear. Where did you learn to do that? Otis looked at her and smiled gently. A long time ago, in a place no one asks about. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Word spread fast. The CEO held a press conference the next morning, praising a member of our team whose hidden talents changed everything. But when reporters asked for Otis's title, he hesitated, then mumbled, he works in facilities. Otis wasn't there to hear it. He was at home, making breakfast for Simone, who had no idea her father had just prevented a multi-million-dollar disaster. She only knew that he'd left a note saying, pancakes tomorrow. But not everyone dismissed what happened. The woman in the black SUV finally stepped out. Her name was Angela Carter, a cybersecurity analyst for a federal agency that monitored cyber threats across private sectors. She had been tracking the ransomware group for months and recognized the pattern in Greydrop's attack. What stunned her was not that the company had been hit, but that someone inside had solved it before she even got a call. When she read the logs, she saw the signature embedded in the recovery script. O. Monroe. She found his military file buried under layers of outdated clearance codes. She found his old papers from a decade ago, white papers on threat modeling and network resilience. She even found a recommendation letter written by a colonel that ended with the words, Otis Monroe is the smartest man in the room. He just won't be the one to say it. Angela called the CEO directly. Do you have any idea who you've been hiring to mop your floors? The CEO stumbled through an answer. She didn't wait. She asked for Otis's contact information. That afternoon, Otis received a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't pick up. When he did, her voice was calm, respectful, and direct. Mr. Monroe, I believe you just saved a company from a catastrophic attack. Would you have a moment to talk? Otis paused. Sure, he said, but only if you don't mind hearing from a janitor. She chuckled. Sir, I've read your code. I know exactly who you are. Meanwhile, inside Greydrop, things were shifting. Engineers who had once laughed behind closed doors were now avoiding his gaze. The CEO walked past him in the hallway, nodded awkwardly, then kept moving. Only Ava met his eyes with the same honesty she always had. She handed him a cup of coffee, the good kind from her own machine, and said, They don't deserve you. Otis shrugged. Maybe not, but the system needed fixing. That's what mattered. That night, he didn't go straight home. He walked through the city, watching lights flicker through windows, listening to the low hum of traffic. He passed a newsstand where his name wasn't in the headlines, and that suited him just fine. He didn't want fame. He wanted purpose. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to feel it again. What he didn't know was that across town, Angela was already drafting a proposal. She wasn't the only one. A quiet storm had been unleashed, not of code or cyber attacks, but of recognition. Somewhere, a door was opening, and this time, someone was holding it open with both hands. The next morning arrived with a softness that didn't match what was about to unfold. The air was still, the sun hiding behind a thin veil of clouds, and Otis Monroe showed up at work exactly on time, just like he had for the past 4 years. No fanfare, no celebration, just Otis with his mop bucket, his key ring, and the quiet strength of someone who had carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. But inside Greydrop Technologies, things weren't the same. The atmosphere had changed. Whispers followed him down the hallway. Not a mockery this time, but confusion, shame, awe. People who had barely glanced in his direction before were now stepping aside when he passed, as if unsure whether to apologize or just disappear. Otis didn't react. He moved the same way he always had, methodical, calm, one task at a time, until he reached the lobby, where a man in a tailored gray suit stood waiting, holding a leather portfolio and wearing a look that made the receptionist sit up straighter. He stepped forward when Otis appeared and extended his hand with sincerity. "Mr. Monroe, my name is Benjamin Cole. I represent a federal agency. We've been following your work." Otis looked at the hand, then the eyes behind it, reading them like lines of code. "No elegance, just intent. I didn't know I had any work worth following," he said, voice steady. Benjamin smiled. "That recovery script you ran? It contained a custom decryption loop I haven't seen outside defense contracts. We traced the algorithm back to a classified framework. One you helped build." Otis nodded slowly. "That was a long time ago." Benjamin's expression shifted, not to pity, but to respect. "Some things don't expire, sir. Talent doesn't expire." Just then, the CO stepped into the room, unaware of the conversation taking place. His face lit up with surprise. "Ah, Otis. There you are. I was actually looking for you." He turned to Benjamin, hand extended. "I'm Daniel Riker, founder and CEO of Greydrop. We're so proud to have Otis on our team. He's become a symbol here, a reminder that everyone matters." Benjamin didn't shake his hand. He simply said, "That's funny. I heard you told reporters he worked in facilities." Daniel's smile faltered. Otis said nothing, just turned and walked back toward the elevator. But Benjamin followed. "Mr. Monroe, I'd like to offer you a role. Not janitorial, not support staff. We're assembling a team to lead a national cyber defense program. Your insight, your background, it's exactly what we need." Otis didn't answer right away. He looked out the glass wall at the city stretching beyond, the same streets he'd walked at night when no one knew his name. "I appreciate the offer," he said after a long pause, "but I have a daughter finishing school, and a job I promised to finish." Benjamin nodded. "Of course. I'll leave you my card. If you change your mind." He placed it gently on the desk beside the mop bucket, then turned and walked away. Meanwhile, upstairs in the executive lounge, the internal audit team had finished their report. They discovered the vulnerability had been flagged months ago by a third-party scan, but ignored by the CTO. It had been logged, dismissed, and buried. When the news reached the board, the CTO resigned quietly that afternoon. By sunset, the story had already leaked. Not just about the breach, but about the man who stopped it. Blogs picked it up. Forums lit up. The janitor who saved a tech company. Unknown genius hides in plain sight. Photos of Otis circulated, always from a distance, always with a mop in hand. No one had asked him for permission. He didn't seem to mind. But what came next wasn't a headline. It was a phone call from someone Otis hadn't heard from in years. A voice on the line, rough but familiar. "Monroe, is it really you?" It was Franklin Hayes, his former commanding officer. The last time they spoke, it had been through a hospital curtain after a mission went sideways in Kabul. Franklin was one of the few who ever saw Otis at full capacity. "Saw your name on the feed. I knew you didn't disappear. You just went quiet." Otis laughed softly. Quiet was the point. Franklin's voice lowered. "The world needs men like you again. They just forgot how to look." That night, Greydrop CEO sent out a company-wide email announcing a new diversity and inclusion initiative, citing Otis as an example of unseen excellence. It rang hollow. Even staff knew it. But something else happened that mattered more. Ava, the receptionist, organized a quiet gathering in the break room. No cameras, no press, just coffee, banana bread, and a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for seeing what we didn't." Otis stepped in, surprised. And for the first time in that building, people clapped for him. Not out of obligation, out of something closer to redemption. Someone asked if he had anything to say. He looked around, eyes scanning faces that once ignored him, now watching with hope. He spoke softly. "I don't need a title. I don't want applause. I just want people to stop assuming what someone can or cannot do by how they look or where they sweep the floor." Then he smiled. Because sometimes the floor you're cleaning is the same one that someone else is standing on while they're looking down on you. Silence followed. A heavy, thoughtful silence. And then a voice from the back, cracking slightly, said, "Thank you, Otis." The next morning, the CEO's office door remained closed. Word had spread that the board was reconsidering leadership. But Otis didn't wait for politics to catch up. He walked into HR, handed in a resignation letter, and requested his final paycheck be split. Half for him, half for a scholarship fund Ava was setting up in his name. By noon, his locker was empty. By 1, he was gone. No farewell post. No press release. Just the soft closing of a door behind him and the echo of a legacy too large to be contained by one company's silence. What remained was the change he left behind. A ripple through a place that had once looked right through him. A crack of light in a room that had been far too dark for far too long. A month later, Otis Monroe woke before sunrise like he always had, not because he had to, but because stillness was a habit his soul never unlearned. The air in his apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the coffee pot and the faint scratch of a pencil as Simone worked through her college application essays at the kitchen table. She had written the words, "My father is the smartest man I know," and underlined it twice. Otis never read it. He didn't need to. That morning, instead of dressing in his uniform, he pulled on a simple button-up shirt and a pair of clean jeans. No mop, no badge, just himself. At precisely 9 a.m., a knock echoed at the front door. When he opened it, Angela Carter stood on the other side, not with an offer, but with a folder. Inside was a role that didn't come with press or spotlight, just purpose. Cyber Threat Prevention Analyst. Flexible hours. Quiet work with impact. Otis studied the paper, then looked up at her. "Will I be working alone?" She smiled. "Only if you want to. But we could use your wisdom to train a new generation. People who don't come from fancy schools, but know how to think." He took the folder, nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, said yes to something he didn't have to settle for. Weeks passed. He began consulting part-time, quietly, efficiently like he always had. He worked from home most days, with Simone nearby, sometimes asking questions about string theory or systems logic. He never corrected her, only offered a better question in return. One Friday morning, he returned to Gray Drop, not with a mop, but to visit Ava at the front desk. She had left too, starting her own nonprofit to mentor young people in tech from underfunded neighborhoods. She hugged Otis tightly, handed him a lanyard printed with his name and the word advisor, and whispered, "We named the scholarship after you." Across the city, word of Otis's story had spread, not through headlines, but through whispers in the right places. A small feature ran in a local paper. The janitor who knew everything. But Otis never framed it. Instead, he kept a photo on his desk of his late wife smiling at the beach, beside a sticky note with one line. "Don't let them tell you who you are." He had found peace in the quiet again, but this time, not because the world had forgotten him, because now it finally remembered. The former CTO of Gray Drop sent him a handwritten letter months later, apologizing not for the breach, but for never asking his name. Otis read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness didn't always need a reply. On weekends, he volunteered at a local tech center, guiding kids through code, explaining the beauty of logic and rhythm in ways that made even shy students raise their hands. One boy asked, "Were you really a janitor?" Otis grinned. "Yes, and I still clean up messes. Just a different kind now." In the neighborhood where he lived, people started recognizing him. Not with fanfare, but with soft nods, longer eye contact, small gestures of respect. The woman who once never returned his good mornings now waved from across the street. The man at the coffee shop who never looked up from his laptop now held the door open when Otis approached. And Ava, in a moment neither dramatic nor planned, said it best as they watched Simone speak at her high school graduation. "You changed the way people see the invisible. That's more than most people do in a lifetime." Otis didn't answer. He just watched his daughter take the podium, her words steady and clear, her pride undeniable. He didn't need anyone to say his name out loud. His legacy wasn't written in titles or press releases or applause. It was written in moments, in doors quietly opened, in silence filled with truth, in the way people now looked each other in the eye. Otis Monroe became a symbol not because he demanded recognition, but because he gave the world no choice but to notice what it had ignored for too long. And through every email, every classroom, every handshake with someone who once believed they had no voice, his presence lingered. A reminder that brilliance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up early, sweeps the floor, and waits for the right moment to change everything. In the final days of summer, with the scent of warm pavement and jasmine hanging in the air, Otis Monroe sat on a wooden bench outside the local library, his hands resting on his knees, watching children chase each other through dappled sunlight. He wasn't waiting for anything. He simply enjoyed the quiet. Across the park, a woman with silver hair and soft eyes approached him slowly, her steps measured, her smile familiar. It was Mrs. Galvez, an old neighbor who used to glance away when they passed each other on the stairs. Now, she sat beside him with a gentle nod and handed him a brown paper bag. Inside was a piece of lemon cake and a note that read simply, "Thank you for staying kind, even when the world forgot how to be." Otis folded the paper slowly, tucked it into his pocket, and offered her a piece of the cake. They ate in silence. No words were needed. Around them, the world continued on, unaware of the legacy being built from the ground up, without noise, without ceremony. That evening, he returned home and opened a letter addressed to Simone. She had been accepted into a university on full scholarship. The name of the fund printed at the bottom read the O. Monroe Foundation. He didn't cry. He smiled the way men do when their hearts are full, but their eyes stay dry. That night, before bed, he lit a single candle near his late wife's photo, whispered a few words of thanks, and sat still in the glow of memory and fulfillment. The next morning, he walked to the local community center where he'd begun helping veterans learn basic computer skills. He greeted each person by name, took time with those who struggled, and always left last. One afternoon, as he was leaving, a small girl held up a drawing with his name scribbled across the top. She said, "My mom says you helped fix the whole internet." He laughed softly and said, "Not the whole thing, just a tiny part that needed someone to care." That drawing now hangs above his desk. No awards, no certificates, just crayon lines and a smile. In the years that followed, stories about Otis spread, but never in headlines. They traveled by word of mouth, shared between colleagues, whispered in classrooms, told as lessons to those who doubted their own worth. In one university, a young professor began every course on system design with a single slide that showed Otis's silhouette beside a quote, "You don't need a title to be a solution." In a corporate boardroom across the country, a new hiring policy was written with one line in bold, "Seek the ones you overlook." And in that small neighborhood in East Oakland, people remembered the man who never raised his voice, never asked for more, and never stopped giving. One spring afternoon, a reporter from a major news outlet found Otis walking out of a hardware store. She asked for a few minutes of his time, said the world needed more stories like his. He listened, then said kindly, "Let the story stay where it belongs, with the people who needed it most. I'm just passing through." She didn't press. She simply thanked him, and he tipped his cap and walked on. On his birthday, Simone brought him a framed photo of the two of them from years ago, taken before the world changed, before anyone knew who he was. On the back, she'd written, "Thank you for showing me how quiet strength can move mountains." He placed it on the nightstand and stared at it for a long while. Then he turned off the light. That evening, a group of teenagers walked into the tech center where Otis had once volunteered. The room was quiet, and in the center stood a glass case with a single mop cleaned and polished beneath a plaque that read, "In honor of Otis Monroe, who cleaned floors and cleared firewalls, who gave his place its first real lesson in seeing." No one spoke. They just stood there, breathing in the quiet. And above them, near the ceiling, someone had painted a line in small, silver letters. "Greatness doesn't wear a name tag." In the final quiet of that story, Otis Monroe is not a myth, not a legend, not a symbol sculpted by publicists or polished biographies. He is simply a man who showed up, who listened, who watched carefully when others dismissed, and who reminded the world that sometimes the most extraordinary people were the simplest uniforms. As the voice of the narrator returns, soft, low, and honest, it says this: sometimes you will feel invisible. Sometimes you will wonder if your worth is measured by titles, by paychecks, by who notices you. But never forget, the world is always watching. And in the quiet moments, when no one claps and no one is looking, who you are still matters. And if you ever doubt that, remember Otis Monroe, the janitor who saved a company, changed lives, and walked away without ever needing to be called hero. Thank you for watching. If this story touched something in you, if you believe in the power of quiet strength, subscribe to Cracks of Light. There are more stories waiting to be told. And you might just be living one.